welcome to our MEL Learning Series today. Thank you all so much for being here. Great, I think we will go ahead and kick off. So thank you again for being here. I am Sarah Roteach from Global Schools Forum, joined by my colleagues Mercy and Ekaterina, and we are very much looking forward to talking about building your MEL foundations and your MEL capacity today. So thank you again for being here. We're looking forward to sharing some resources as well as creating some time for us to work together and learn from each other. So I will go ahead and share. Mercy, do you mind giving me permission to share? And as we get that set up, if you would like to change your name on Zoom to include the name of your organization, that way we can see who all is represented here. Great. So thank you again for being here. Would love for you to take a second again to change your name to include the name of your organization. And then just give a minute and think about what is it that you're hoping to take away from the session today. And you're welcome to just drop that in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself and tell us, we would love to just get a sense of what you are hoping to get out of today's session. We're focusing on simple strategies for robust program evaluation, building on our previous discussions about theory of change and MEL framework, and looking at the next steps in understanding and evaluating your solution. Finding out one thing that we can celebrate and sharing that with implementation teams. I love that. Thanks, Celeste. And best practices in program evaluation, great. Curious about specific strategies that we'll share. Great, and yeah, an opportunity to reflect to see if there are things that you're already doing as well. And quasi-experimental methods. Great. Feel free to keep sharing in the chat, and we will keep going. Just a few housekeeping things. This session is being recorded, and we'll share a link of that recording with you after the session. We have some time built in for questions and answers, but at any time, please feel free to drop questions in the chat or use the raise hand feature in Zoom and we'll be happy to stop and answer any questions along the way. If you're comfortable, we'd love for you to turn your camera on so we can see who all is here. We will have some breakout discussions, and we really encourage you to be present and engaged and take it as an opportunity to be honest about your own experiences as well as to learn from the experiences of others. At the end of the session, we'll launch a short poll. Your participation is really important to us. We would love to know what worked well for you today and if you have any recommendations for future sessions as we're still progressing through this MEL Learning Series. A quick overview of our plan for today. First, we're going to talk about identifying areas for testing. Then we'll move into how to choose your research design. We'll take some time in breakout groups to reflect on different evaluation approaches. Then we'll go into choosing participants, considering ethical requirements, finish with another breakout group about ethical considerations, and finally, we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. But again, feel free to put them in the chat at any time. So we've got a bunch of different emojis here, and we would love for you to choose 3 of them to describe how you feel about sharing your MEL findings with others. So you can describe the emojis out loud or put them in the chat. And we might call on a couple people in the chat to share why you made that choice. I'll put it in the chat if you want to refer back to these emojis, but feel free to choose your own if these don't represent your own thoughts. When I go over that with my mouse, it says grimacing. Do you want to tell us why that describes how you feel?
Do I want to? I feel grimacing about it. I think grimacing for me like captures that like I'm a little bit apprehensive, but then I feel quite determined about it. So I think like I know what we're doing with Mel, and I know that we have work to do to improve it. And I'm determined that we improve, I guess. So it's kind of like just gonna like grit my teeth and dive into this, like, and get to grips with it. Kind of like wrestle it until we've got something that I'm like, woohoo, we're gonna talk about this now.
That's great. Ekaterina, do you want to explain yours?
Sure. It usually starts with the power phase. So like, oh my goodness, where do we start? And then it drives me bananas a little bit on the journey. But overall, I believe that we can do it, and we can persevere back to the grid, and perseverance and success in the end. We are coming stronger in the end of that journey.
Tanyashri, do you want to explain yours?
Yeah, actually, generally it is very excitement with the M&E team when he starts sharing the findings. Then people start with the lens key. It is really programs and M&E never we have a same lens when we see the look at the programs. Then always it coming with the end key. It is very dissatisfied by the program team. What generally we shared with them key this is happened because there is a lot of background work happen in the program level which maybe many times evaluation didn't speak about it. So that gaps always be there. Yeah.
Great. Thank you all so much for sharing. Feel free to keep popping them in the chat. Some of them I'm very curious about. So please keep putting those there if you haven't already. So the session today talking about strategies for evaluation is building on the previous things we have discussed in these sessions, starting with theory of change, which describes how you believe change can happen. It also outlines the main elements for that change. And then the MEL framework builds on the theory of change. It helps you track your solution's progress and understand its impact. And then today we're talking about testing and learning, which helps you plan to test elements of your theory of change and to adapt your implementation based on the results. So at this point, if you've developed a MEL framework, you have lots of questions about all the different elements of your theory of change that you could ask. And testing and learning is about really narrowing in on a handful of those to get really deep knowledge about how those elements are impacting your ultimate change. And to that point, as part of your monitoring universe and your monitoring plan, there are a lot of questions that you could ask to learn more about your solution, either about your solution's implementation or about your solution's impact. So there has to be a process of prioritization, of figuring out what information is the most important to you at this point in your solutions journey. And there are a few different considerations that can help you with this prioritization process. So the first is looking at what gaps and needs you have. So when you're thinking about your whole theory of change, what elements of that do you have the greatest uncertainty about? There might be some elements that you feel like you already have a lot of knowledge about, and others might feel like a black box and you're not quite sure what's inside. So those can be really important areas to highlight when you're thinking about what you want to test. Another consideration is how feasible and practical measuring that element is. So given your current capacity, whether that is in terms of your team or in terms of what's available in your context, which outcomes can you actually test with the resources that are available? Another factor that can be part of this process is actionability. So what knowledge or information is going to help you take action to iterate and to improve your solution? And a final consideration for prioritization is impact. What components in the theory of change do you think are most essential for achieving the desired impact? So by this point, you've developed a theory of change with the logic explaining how you see each element feeding into each other. And based on that logic, there could be some components that you feel there's a very strong rationale for them contributing to your solution. And the stronger that rationale is, when you're looking at those assumptions and the chain of logic, those can be really critical and valuable areas to prioritize when you're thinking about testing. And I will pass it over to Ekaterina to take us through the next section.
Thank you. So let me set up the scene a little bit. While this session is about valuation per se, there are two more sessions coming, one focusing on the qualitative methods and another is quantitative methods. So after carefully reviewing your hopes and expectations, we wouldn't be able to answer all the questions today, but there are more information to come. And it was very difficult to pin it down so we decided that instead of giving a very high level, let's start from the beginning. Let's think about what the actually evaluation process consists of. Let's reflect at every stage, and then in the subsequent sessions, we will drill down in more details into the design and methods, but we'll cover some of it today. Okay, so there are four essential stages, as you know. First, it's to come up with a question and or assumption. Second is research and understanding the design. And third one is about understanding who your participants are and from whom do you need the most meaningful information you possibly can gather in order to answer your question or test your assumption. And of course, last but not least, is to consider ethical implications or ethical requirements from the data that you are collecting. So we'll start with the first one. Defining the question, setting up the question, identifying your assumption, and all those things, the assumption that you have from your theory of change that you took into the MEL framework will help you to define key concepts or constructs, or in other words, variables that will help you to answer the question that the data about which you need, so you can set up the correct question in place, and so you set up the correct design and the correct methods for your evaluation. So there are multiple objectives for your research question. So the one of which might be a understanding the context. So you would want to know how specific features or how your program behave in the new context or in the existing context, but with a new population or with a new sample of targeted audience. You may want to know what's the demand like, what's the needs like, what's the challenges. So you may know that the intervention is happening, but you're not necessarily sure how does it happen. Or you may want to know what are specific barriers and challenges that stopping the decisions, stopping the program to lead to the success or a change that you hope to achieve. You can also want to ask questions related to the solution. So you may want to know about user experience. You may want to know about cost effectiveness. You may want to know about the generally delivery of the solution or fidelity of solution. So if your solution become of a black box or kind of a mystery to you, asking the questions about what your solution is like on the ground is very good questions. It's a good questions and right questions to ask. So it helps you to define how your solution, how does the process of your solution or intervention works, but also in what dosage and what amounts your solution the most effective, and how much is enough really. And then of course, then you can pass a responsibility to your users, teachers, or learners, because it's not just on you to deliver the intervention and hope that it will be successful. It's also for them to take that intervention in, to change their behavior, to create lesson plans, to participate in the training or coaching, and also be part of that intervention. So more you know about your intervention, more responsibility and accountability you can share with your stakeholders and your recipients of your intervention. And of course, the evaluation per se of the solution, meaning does it actually work? Does it achieve those outcomes we drafted or we sketched in our theory of change? Remember, we all worked on the theory of change. Outcomes, what change did we anticipate due to this program and intervention? So we can ask lots of questions related to its impact. How does this feature works compared to other feature? Is it still leading to the desired changes in behavior or changes in learning outcomes and so on? Does it help us to, also we can ask questions related to how our outcomes vary if we are testing different groups or different conditions, but also we can drill down into the pool of recipients of the intervention and try to understand why this intervention worked for this particular group of children and doesn't really work for others, or does it work for everyone? Or is there a particular group of kids who is not getting what we hope that they would get better? So what can we change and do for them in order to improve their outcomes? Next, please. So that's the landscape of the questions: context, solution, or evaluation. Now, when we have the questions, now we have a key assumptions and decide what's main purpose of that question and answering that question, we can start to think about the design. How can we find answers, the most meaningful and the most reliable information to answer that question, to get the information, to get the data? So we analyze that and we get the insights that we need in order to improve our solution or in order to scale our solution. It depends where we are, or both. And then, of course, you have a toolbox. And those tools might be in your toolbox, and they're all good. There are no bad and good solution tools. They're all helpful. They just have different functions. And it's very much depends on the question you want to ask. And that question will lead to what you need. If you are building a table, for example, you may not necessarily need a digger, but if you're building a road, digger could be pretty instrumental. So, and also digger is not all you need in order to build a wonderful road from destination A to destination B. What I'm trying to say, sometimes you may want to use multiple tools, and that can give you different data points, different insights that can give you the most comprehensive picture and the most comprehensive answer to your research question. Okay, so remember the theory of change. Theory of change, I will talk about theory of change so many times and all the time. Theory of change we love very, very much because theory of change is foundational for everything. It's a roadmap, remember? It's our blueprint. So if it is, we are building on it or using it as a foundation, as a starting point every time. So if we reflect back on your theory of changes and specifically outputs, then there are a range of questions that you and range of the types of evaluations that you may want to ask and raise as a part of that output testing. And usually those are understanding things to do with your stakeholders, understanding with mapping your outcomes, understanding what is good and how does good look like in the field or in the space where you are in your program is, understanding the fidelity of your program, the quality of your program, as well as understanding how certain features behave within in the relation to the change we hope to achieve. So for that, we can use different evaluation approaches. For instance, if we want to know about how our users, learners, educators, stakeholders are experiencing our intervention, then we want to use stakeholder feedback. For that, we will use certain tools. We can use focus groups, semi-structured interviews, and of course, surveys that also can help us to map the outcomes. And it also helps us to map the perspectives, attitude, beliefs of our stakeholders, not just the feedback. If we are interested to know what's the average in the field for the space where we are, for example, we want to compare how the intervention, our schools where we are compared to the national standards, we can do the benchmarking research and we can use comparative studies, or we can use as basic as descriptive statistics. And that still could be very meaningful for us to understand if our kids are any different to where the rest of the country is, for better or worse. We can also learn a lot about the quality of our programs and also how much is enough. It's very much related to not only to the delivery, not only to the implementation, but also something to do with the cost effectiveness. The fidelity assessment allows you to understand what is your program actually about. You created it, you conceptualized it, you developed the content, and you pushed it into the real world. But what happened out there in the real world, we're not quite clear until we do the fidelity assessment. And for that, we can use a variety of methods from our toolbox. We can do the classroom observations. We can observe what's happening on the ground. We can do implementation checklists and completion rates and number of lessons and lots of indicators. For if you have an ed tech, you can have lots and lots of indicators on the basis of the collection data at the back end. And of course, you can do the lesson plans reviews, you can do the assessment reviews, you can do the overall descriptive statistics on all those indicators or indicators that associate with your program. So that will help you to verify, for example, whether educators following the curriculum the way you prescribed it, your intervention prescribed it, or whether they not, and actually why not. And then, of course, if you are trialing different methods, for example, you may use traditional coaching versus digital coaching, and you've still keen very much, your theory of change hasn't changed despite the delivery method, you're still very keen on achieving the great outcomes for children, but you're trying to streamline, you're trying to scale. You may want to use experimental methods. You can even use RCTs to test how different approaches of delivery of your program. Now we know everything about fidelity, but what if we change an element or a feature of our program? Does it still work? Do we still achieve the results we hope to achieve? So all those things are helpful for us to understand different stages of evaluation of our program or different elements to evaluate as we progress at the level of the outputs. On the level of the outcomes, we obviously want to know about change. We want to know if our learners getting better learning and improving the learning outcomes. We want to know if our teachers improving their practices. We want to know if our senior management team at schools becoming better leaders and creating the great environment for learning and teaching. So for that, we use the variety of different approaches. Our favorite one, and the easiest probably of all, is pre and post. We are using the standard tools of surveys, standardized tests, knowledge check-ins, and so on. And we just simply see if there are intervention, especially when we're just piloting intervention, if intervention works on the ground. So what happened before and what's happened after. If we are keen and we are have the established intervention, we piloted it, we have the promising results on pre and post, we are able to collect multiple points of data and we're able to track children or teachers, whatever your intervention is addressing or solution is addressing, we can reflect on the multiple data points and across a longer period of times and across multiple cohorts, we can do the longitudinal tracking or regression modeling. And regression modeling will allow us to understand if we take in account baseline and the multiple factors, as well as class size, maybe the region, maybe teachers' education, maybe other factors, does things are still improving. So regression modeling is actually a really helpful tool that, in my opinion, quite underrated. And for that, you use, again, very, very simple tools like cohort tracking, follow-up surveys, progress reports. You continue to monitor on your cohorts, and using this monitoring data will allow you to have more complex statistical models that can help you to understand not only whether it works, yes, no, but potentially why does it work and what particular factors has an impact or have an effect on the intervention success. RCTs we all love, of course. It's our golden standard, and it does matter. It is important when we work with the tens and hundreds of schools, and we really want to know whether and we know that correlation isn't causation, and we really want to attribute the certain changes and certain improvements to our program, then high quality QEDs or strong, robust, well-powered, well-balanced RCTs are definitely a way to assess, evaluate your interventions. And for that, you of course need comparison groups. You need to make sure that the participants randomly assigned in those groups. You have a control group where there is no exposure to the treatment or to the intervention. And then you also have the clarity on your fidelity assessment, on your or clarity on the fidelity of your intervention, sorry. And this is important because we want to know that the intervention is everywhere being delivered in the same way. And by the way, we are, as we do in our cities, as we're conducting our cities, we are not changing, we are not intervening with our interventions. We're not adding new features, we're not iterating the process of training, we're not adding new things into it, otherwise it will spoil the experiment. And finally, last but not least, is the case studies. What if we're not able to do RCTs just yet? We are relatively young, or we are established organization, but we just have a relatively young intervention, and we still have some promising results. What can we do? We can do the case studies, and case studies are helpful for documenting the change in this pool of the participants or pool of our users, of our intervention, recipients of an intervention. And for that, we can use observations, interviews, narrative analysis, and even some certain quantitative data, but with that particular area, with a particular context, with a particular area. Especially if we're exploring new, when we're scaling, we're exploring new contexts, we're exploring new regions or new demographics, that case studies could be very helpful for us to drill down in understanding how our intervention behave in those new certain conditions. Okay, that was a lot of me talking, and that was a lot of information. We will give you a little bit of time to reflect on that information in the groups. And we will ask you to share your experiences, and we also, of course, will share the tables that I just talked about, talked through. And we ask you to think about the research activities that you might be considering in the context of both outputs and outcomes, and come up with some examples of the evaluation approaches that may be most relevant to your intervention. So out of the array of different tools and array of different options and questions that you may want to ask on the basis of the theory of changes you recently created or updated, on the basis of the MEL frameworks that you reflected on. What were the most priority-driven questions or assumptions that you wish to challenge, whether it's output assumptions, whether it's outcome assumptions, and how could you challenge those? What methods would be the most useful to you? Yeah, and share your experiences as well. What were your experiences like when you were evaluating things in the context of output? What were your experiences like when you are evaluating your intervention and the outcomes level? And then we'll see you back with the examples to share. And Sarah shared the note-taking document in the chat as well. So please feel free to use that for feeding back or use it in your groups.
I'm just going to share my screen really quick to highlight what it's going to look like. So the instructions are here. We've put our examples of different evaluation approaches, research methods here, as well as an example for each of them. So when you come down here, you're just going to be brainstorming some different research questions that you might be interested in for your own organization, so you can use these as inspiration. Any questions about the format of this before we go into groups? Otherwise, we'll pop in and out to make sure everything's going okay. Great. I'll send you to your breakout rooms now, and then we'll see you back after that.
Welcome back. I hope you had productive conversations, inspiring, and I'd love to hear your examples, your questions, your reflections, whatever you think would be great to share, at least from each representative of each group, please.
And they don't have to be specific research questions, just any reflections on the discussion. Does anyone from group one want to share anything? I think that was the group with Danielle and Celeste.
Sure, I'll share. I think I just one of the things that Danielle and I were talking about is how you measure the outcomes for the children themselves, and so sort of that conversation around sticking to your theory of change, because our interventions deal with actually trying to change teacher behavior. But in the end, a lot of people want to know, well, what does that mean for the students? And then how do you balance that out? And Danielle had some great reflections on, sticking to your intervention. And we just talked about how you make it, what your intervention actually can change, and then what that may do down the road, and things like that. So for me, our challenge is to keep everybody on track. So I think sometimes the theory of change there isn't always thought for practically how that theory of change will actually be used in the field. And so creating that sort of dynamic throughout the organization for every project we do, which is always different. And yeah, so that was it. But Danielle has some great insights, so I'm really appreciative of that.
Celeste, can I ask you a quick question on that? Like, are you at Educate using, like, creating a theory of change for each of the different interventions, or do you have one overarching one?
Yeah, so we have an overarching, but it tends not to be the primary one, because the overarching one for the schools, our own schools, would clearly be very different than one that is doing a tablet intervention in 100 schools. So I find that, and that's actually an interesting thing about how we're set up, is that the theory of change has usually been done by the time the M&E team gets involved. And so this is really fantastic discussion for me, because I wonder should we be involved earlier on? And sometimes they'll say, hey, do you want to input? Of course I want to input, but then do I want to be involved in every single theory of change, when sometimes it really is more implementation, like actually what they want to do, the education side of it, rather than the tracking. So they do differently. They do different ones for almost every project we do, which is a lot of extra work possibly for them.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
The next group was the group with Patrick in it. Does anyone from that group want to share any reflections on your discussion?
I think to share a little bit, and my colleagues can jump in. There's something that we kind of thought that when you're doing several initiatives, it somehow becomes challenging to come up with one kind of M&E or evaluation, and it kind of becomes a little bit taxing, and many people sometimes feel or get it difficult to sum up, like what research questions are you looking at, because everything kind of like there are so many things that you're doing at the same time. But when we kind of discussed, you see, we was talking about mostly we do some surveys to understand where we are starting with an intervention, and like the pre and then the post that will tell us like were we able to meet the expectation or the indicators of the outputs that we wanted, and also the outcomes. Sometimes like longitudinal or following up or tracking maybe students, something that could be easily, if you want, you are working with students that are moving from one position to another, you can do kind of a tracking. But I was actually telling my colleagues that at Kenya Connect, we are in the point of developing our M&E it is taking some time because we do not have an expert, but we are learning as we continue so that we can be able to understand in every intervention. But I was saying that we have a theory of change, and probably now we can work from now the theory of change, looking at what are each of the programs that we are running we can be able to measure. And maybe somebody else can chip in.
Yeah, just adding to Patrick, one thing I really heard in our discussion, many times evaluation is not possible due to if it is a conflict zone, if student is not a student or any of your beneficiaries is not able to be reached through any contact, means for school we are not able to contact students, so that is one limitation. So some of the process is not possible due to some circumstances. Many times we started some process, for example, we took the ethical approval, we started research, in the mid of the thing something happened, so the natural calamities or something. I can say a small example. When we started a study, COVID happened, and the whole ethical approval, it is a one-to-one face physical interviews, then back to the agency to have a telephonic interview, and those arrangements, and many times the network is a issue. So those are the challenges is always there. And really for me when I used to, for my organization recently we choose for the longitudinal testing, but not RCT. Based on this all things, anything can be happen, maybe longitudinal test can be more little you can just track the cohort for the next 5 years. But still now I have a question, which is the more, I know RCT is always be more valuable, but if I can compare RCT to longitudinal study, which is the most appropriate and the for the global level, that also I want to know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a question in there because we were just talking at the end of our group session about like doing a longitudinal study versus having an RCT. The Tanushree saying, and I don't know if this is always the case, that the longitudinal study is cheaper than doing the RCT. And I was just talking about how for us in a conflict zone, it might just work better to do a longitudinal study rather than try to do an RCT for which the research design is like very rigid and can't quite flex for the things that might come up, like the disruption that might happen in a conflict zone. So yeah, we'll be really interested in your responses to that. I think the other reflection that I have is just like this thing of like having different theories of change for all your different components of what you do if you are a school operator. What's interesting for me is that I don't think that school networks generally have MEL frameworks unless they're in the global education sector. So they do a lot of MEL, but a lot of school networks don't have theories of change, don't have log frames, don't have this, that, and the next thing. And more than that, they tend to have like they use the framework that the inspection in that country uses, and then they create their own kind of dashboard that speaks to that. And they do a lot, like, and they will have like a student information system. So for Global Schools Forum, which has like lots of school operators in it, and I know we have lots of non-school operators now as well, but I am curious about like the best way forward for school operators in this context, and what adaptations need to be made to MEL frameworks for them to really be fit for purpose for school networks.
Lots of really great comments. Please, Sarah, go on.
Well, maybe I can start, and then if you want to jump in and have anything else. I think the first question about thinking about research designs in relation to your context is a really great point. And I think that's kind of how we see it, the slide about the tools and understanding the tools and the purpose, that it's not always about a hierarchy where some kinds of research are better than others. It's about what's going to get you the answers you need and what tools are even available that suit your context. So I think it's about finding that match, and yeah, thinking about how to find the best information, but it's not always about doing an RCT or not doing an RCT, because, for example, you might have general data about if it's learning outcomes, maybe you have general data about learning outcomes in your country. So even if you don't have a control group, you might still be able to collect information that's going to help you understand how are your students doing compared to students in the rest of the country, or different things like that. But the more you learn about your context and what other people are doing, I think it's possible to come up with creative and helpful research, even if you're not able to get a control group for an RCT. And to the point about what school networks are doing and whether that is, based on a theory of change in a MEL framework, I think that whether or not people often have a theory of change might be separate from the question of whether it's helpful to have a theory of change. I think whether you're no matter what type of organization you are, a theory of change is still a helpful, an important foundation. So I would say that even if it's not, even if it's not standard or you're finding that other people aren't using it, I do think that it's valuable. And once you have your theory of change and now you're getting to your MEL framework where you're coming up with questions aligned with each of those elements, I think that's a great point to also bring in anything else from outside that is important to your partners or your funders. That's one of the places in our MEL framework template is what kinds of questions are funders or potential partners asking. And it's always possible to bring those additional things in. But I do think that regardless, having a theory of change is going to be a strong starting point, whether you're a school network or another kind of organization.
Just to quickly add on the point, yes, you're absolutely right. The RCT seems to be a requirement, and it is a gold standard, and it is something that ecosystem is craving and generate demands for. But really, from the methodological point of view, all RCT tells us that intervention tells us about causality, that intervention works, right? That there is nothing else, whereas longitudinal data could be way richer, just generally for the population who you work with. And it could be way more meaningful because you can see year-on-year change, and you can keep track of different things that changing as children progress year on year. So if, as Sarah proposed, for example, using the benchmarking compared to national averages and so on, that and making a comprehensive case, I still believe that there is, despite the demand, there is a world where the strong, robust longitudinal or panel designs could be compelling, because if they are robust and if they are demonstrate the change year on year, and they are comparative to the established standards, then it could be very meaningful information, and it could be very indicative that the intervention works despite not having RCT in place. But yes, RCT almost like quick and easy way. I'm saying easy, but it could be substantially quicker than year-on-year data collection across, let's say, 10 years of child's education, formal education, child life or formal education. As for how to target or how to tailor MEL tools to the school operators, I think it's very important to ensure that they're both reflective of the priorities and strategic priorities of the schools, and they need to be tailored to the specific needs and the change they're hoping to achieve. Yes, learning outcomes in general and children are thriving, but what specifically make unique those school operators, and that needs to be reflective in their theory of changes, and as it is reflected in their theory of changes leading into the MEL frameworks. The different matter for the school operators is the capacity and knowledge within the team, an ability to be able to perform evaluations or develop new knowledge or knowledge products, or even run the assessments. But that's something that could be worked with, and it could be and certainly needs to be tailored to the needs and to the change they're hoping to achieve and the specific activities those schools do.
Yeah, maybe just in that tool, I'm just thinking out loud, so I don't know how this is going to sound when it comes out of my head, but there is like what funders ask for, but there's also what the government asks for if you're being regulated by the government. And so if there's data that we have to collect because we have to report it regularly to the government, then I think that's relevant.
For sure, and that's ideally would be reflected in your MEL framework. So there is a benefit of mapping, and different funders will also require different bits of information, and they will have a different emphasis on different aspects of what they want to change within the organization as well. So having the understanding and a mapping of what government, what kind of indicators or data government is actually care about, as well as key funders that you have or hope to have, and collect data against it, could be really beneficial to, and could be quite foundational in structuring your MEL systems in place. Okay, thank you so much for your insights and valuable points. I think it was really, really helpful part of the conversation. Shall we look into slides, Elizabeth? Would you share them, Sarah, please? All right, so we talked about different approaches and different tools, and you've noticed that we didn't talk specifically about which school they belong, whether they're qualitative or quantitative or even mixed. And the reality of it that in your toolbox, most likely you would be using multiple tools, and across, it depends on what's the question you're asking, what data you're after. So qualitative is allow you a depth, allow you qualitative allows you depth and allow you to understand the bigger picture, understand the context, that allow you to understand the flavors. It will understand you to understand the colors. It gives you the very, very insightful information in terms of how things happening on the ground. Depends on the questions, of course, you're asking, and gives you very, very rich information. Typically, you would use the interviews and observations and focus groups, which are almost a type of interviews, really. And you not after the big samples, and you not after the statistics. It doesn't really matter. It's what's matter is the story behind it, and what you will collect that data up to the point when you start to hear similar stories again and again. So you would know that you pretty much got the whole picture. With the quantitative, we are establishing hypotheses. We are very much interested in numbers. We want to know everything about the patterns and links and the associations, and we use the surveys and the descriptive data, and we're using the test experiments and modeling. And that tells us that things are related to one another, but really doesn't give a bigger context. In order to understand the reality, the best way is to utilize both, and in different proportions, of course, depends on what your needs, but mixed methods is the way, most likely the most comprehensive way for you to understand how your intervention really works. You can use the mixed methods simultaneously, meaning that you can use the quantitative and qualitative data in the same time, and you can drill down into the numbers, crunch the numbers, as well as understand why exactly things like they are. You can start with the qualitative to understand the background. You can do the explorations, you can do the field research, you can talk to lots of stakeholders and understand where they're coming from, what's the story behind the challenges and problems they're dealing with, and then go into the specific exploration of the relationship or patterns, statistical relationship or patterns. And then, of course, you can do it other way around. You spotted something in your survey or your monitoring data. You're not quite sure what's going on there. It may be a little bit worrying or a little bit concerning and things not going to plan. Then maybe the good idea would be to go and speak to people who is on the ground implementing your intervention, for instance, and can provide you the context why the numbers or patterns the way they are. And then we are, of course, decided with the research methods. We had a question, we decided with the research methods, which way we're going, quantitative, qualitative mix, and we are using our toolbox. And now we need to reflect on who is our population and how do we conduct our sampling. So when we think about our participants, we are thinking about sample who we work with rather than the whole population. But it does matter for us to understand that these people who are involved in our studies or our evaluations are representing that global population of these demographic characteristics people. And it's really important to understand who they are, what characterizes them, and are they able to provide the most meaningful information and the most relevant information in order for us to make a decision about implementation, adaptation, or scaling. It's really also important to understand that it's not just about that they are generally representing this sample of people who you have access to, representing the whole population, but also worth drilling down into subgroups. It's worth understanding what their demographic characteristics is, what their disability status, what their schools type or religion or family income or parents' education, and so on. So understanding what is demographic setup and the education setup of our sample is matter and important, and that will help us to make interferences later on the basis of the bigger sets of data. And of course, when we are creating the evaluation plan, we really need to think about how many participants do we need, who those participants are, and what groups of participants will be holding the most meaningful information for us. How do we access those participants, and what are routes to those participants, and what the challenges might be. Knowing those things will help us to avoid the potential dropout or lack of data later when we are invested in very expensive RCT and very carefully balance it late as a part of our design. And now I pass it to Sarah.
The last step that we're going to talk about today is considering ethical requirements. So this is about understanding what steps you need to take to ensure ethical standards as well as ethical approval. But we're going to start by, before we share our thoughts about ethics, we want to know what your thoughts are. So think about one of the research activities that you might be considering, whether it's something that you talked about in the previous breakout group or or something else, and think about at least one ethical issue that might come up if you were going to do that research. And then think about one practical strategy that you might be able to use to address it. And then when we come back, if you have an example, you can share it with the group. So does anyone have any questions about the activity before we jump into breakout rooms? Great, we'll see you back here in just a few minutes. Hi, Sandeep, just let us know if you're having any trouble getting into the breakout room.
Merci.
Yes, Katarina.
No, just continuing conversation about collating everything together.
Recording. Either group, or let's see, let's start with the group that had Patrick. Anyone want to share an ethical challenge that you discussed might come up in your work?
Yeah, I can share. In our group, actually, it is my personal interest to know about Just Rising, how they are taking the ethical approach. What are the major concerns in their country? Because in India, in the different situation, then we come up with a discussion with the key data privacy is the most important ethical. Yeah, when we are collecting lot of PII data, the personal details data from the student level, from the family level, whatever in the school at the schools, and we can mitigation to how to safeguard this data, how to store this data, how can you safeguard, you can have a system, those you can address it. Yeah, please, Patrick and Ray, add if I can miss anything.
Yeah, I know my friend was talking about sometimes also using consent forms as a way of addressing some ethical issues that may come up. And also being keen on, especially when you are working with students. And again, I may add that different countries will also require or they have different rules about data privacy and all that. It's just a kind of like adhering to the country's rules that they have. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Anyone from the second group want to share? Well, now we'll tell you our thoughts. Thanks so much for sharing your own about ethics, and then here are a few additional thoughts from us.
Sorry.
Oh, Yeah.
No, I didn't realize which group I was in because I
Oh,
think
sorry. Yeah, we just had
previously.
2 groups that time. Yeah, so
Oh,
you're
okay. Yeah, so for us, we discussed for two of us, we work with children about similar age groups. And for the different groups, like for us specifically, we consent because we mostly work with children's homes and rescue centers, and they have caregivers. So they're like foster homes. So they do have caregivers there, and they're the ones we explain to what we do and the kind of data that we collect and how we use the data. So there's a consent form that we explain to them, and they sign that because it's very important. And I think it was, I don't know how to pronounce his name from Axiom. I don't to I don't like mispronouncing people's
Peter.
names. Sorry?
Peter.
Oh, so it's just Peter. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah. Peter had mentioned for them they work with schools. So that involves seeking consent from the school leaders for the programs that they do with the children. So getting consent from them to avoid any issues.
Thanks so much. So I'll just make a couple final points, but before I pull that up, I know we're in our last minute. So if you do need to jump off early or now, please do just take 1 minute to fill out that survey. But we are wrapping up. So here are a few considerations on ethics. First, just for general monitoring and evaluation, your purpose is primarily internal learning. And a few key considerations here are thinking about getting informed consent. Patrick, like you mentioned, voluntary participation. No one should feel forced to participate in the research that you're doing. Data privacy is also something that was mentioned. Making sure that you have equitable participation for the population that you're working with, whether that's around gender or geographic locations or disability status, making sure that you're getting everyone's perspective and everyone is you're able to learn from all of those different groups. Another thing is to think about what kind of data are you really going to be able to use and avoid going above and beyond that to collect data that is not going to be useful to you, because that can lead to beneficiary fatigue, where you're asking people to continually participate in a lot of data collection that isn't actually giving you useful information. And another consideration is thinking about how you're going to share results with your participants. How are you going to feedback what you've learned, so that people who have given their time to you to participate this can also learn more about their context and their peers. And then if you're doing more formal research focused on producing generalizable knowledge and publishing data externally, there are usually additional requirements that are specific to different countries and different locations. So it's important to be aware of what those look like in your setting, to make sure that you're following those formal review processes, especially if you're thinking about publishing your data externally. So thank you again so much for attending. You can use this QR code if that's helpful to fill in the poll, but the link is also in the chat. As far as what we have coming up next, the next session will be on August 28th, called Making Numbers Count, How to Collect and Use Quantitative Data. I know this came up both in your expectations as well as in the chat a little bit. So we'll dive in more specifically about how to design effective quantitative data collection tools, including surveys, classroom observations, and learning assessment tools. And it'll be a similar format to the other sessions. We'll cover some key topics, as well as make time for questions and answers and some group work. So we look forward to seeing you again on August 28th. Thank you so much for being here. Does anyone have any final reflections or thoughts before we log off?